Employer of Last Resort-led Economic Development, A Plan for Tunisia by Fadhel Kaboub. The Tunisian Economy. This year, Tunisia celebrates 50 years since the country earned independence in 1956, after more than 7 decades under French rule. Naturally, the post-colonial era began by an aggressive decolonization, or Tunification, driven to rid the country of French control over its resources. Although Tunisia soon realized that despite its territorial independence, the country lacked the infrastructure and the resources to be truly independent of France. Import substitution industrialization, ISI, was the fashion of the day in the 1960s, and Tunisia was no exception. An ambitious socialist program led by Ahmed Ben Salah, Minister of Economic Planning and Finance, 1961 to 69, was set in motion and worked relatively well for nearly a decade. Had it not been for 3 years of consecutive droughts and bourgeois resistance to agricultural cooperatives, Tunisia could have continued its socialist program into the 1970s. The demise of the socialist experiment marked a complete reversal of policy agenda toward export-led growth and openness to external trade and indebtedness. The opening up of the economy revealed the country's vulnerability to external shocks and its inability to conduct domestic economic policy without continuous outside pressures. Unexpected events, such as French trade barriers to Tunisian textiles, Italian trade barriers to Tunisian olive oil, Libyan deportation of Tunisian workers, and Saudi Arabia's depressing of oil prices, sent Tunisia into deep economic and political crisis in the early 1980s. International finance institutions, IFI, came to the rescue with what might be viewed as the economic blueprint that shaped Tunisia's performance since the mid-1980s. The current economic situation traces its origins back to the political and economic crisis of the 1980s, which led to a change in political leadership in Carthage, as well as in an economic policy shift toward radical, albeit gradual, economic liberalization under the Structural Adjustment Program, SAP. Despite very satisfactory results by IFI-mandated SAP standards, Tunisia's unemployment record remained alarmingly high. It was in this context of mounting socioeconomic pressures stemming from SAP policies that the so-called Solidarity Network, National Solidarity Fund, Tunisian Solidarity Bank, and National Employment Fund was introduced by the government to help cope with unemployment and socioeconomic exclusion in a manner deemed consistent with the overarching SAP agenda. However, despite its emphasis on employment creation, the Solidarity Network was not designed as an employer of last resort program, but merely as a set of programs focusing on job training, self-employment, and microcredits. Such programs have certainly increased employability, but have not increased the aggregate number of jobs in Tunisia. Today, Tunisia is considered a lower middle-income developing country, $2,500 per capita GDP, and is moderately indebted. Total debt stock is around $16 billion, 53.3% of GDP, with 13.1% debt service ratio. In the last 10 years, Tunisia's real GDP growth has averaged 5% and inflation has gravitated around 3%. The poverty rate has been brought down from 22% in 1975 to less than 4% by 2001. Population growth has declined to less than 1% in 2005 compared to 3% in 1966. And life expectancy has reached 74 years in 2004. The total population stands at 10 million people, with a 3.4 million person labor force. However, despite an excellent performance in improving socioeconomic and demographic indicators, Tunisia's unemployment rate remains alarmingly high at 14%. High unemployment is not only an economic problem, but it is also increasingly becoming a social and political issue that has the potential to destabilize Tunisia if not dealt with promptly and strategically. The fight against unemployment in Tunisia has become the #1 priority of the government in the last 5 years. Given the massive investment in human capital that Tunisia has committed itself to since independence, unemployment is considered such a waste of national resources. Tunisia has spent 25% of its annual government budget on public education. Today's unemployment situation reveals that the composition of the unemployment pool has become qualitatively different from what has been the custom in the past. An increasingly sophisticated labor force calls for well-designed employer of last resort program that takes into account the skill mix and career aspiration of the labor force. In 2006, for the first time in Tunisia's history, 2/3 of the first-time job seekers have a university degree. This trend is likely to continue well into the foreseeable future as the number of college students continues to grow exponentially. A closer look at the Tunisian labor market reveals that more than 50% of the unemployed have been actively seeking work for more than 12 months. Unfortunately, despite the urgency of the unemployment situation, the active labor market policy, ALMP, budget has been around 1.5% of GDP, with a meager 0.15% of GDP devoted to direct job creation in public works. Tunisia's development experience mirrors that of many other developing countries. Neither export-led or ISI-led growth has helped establish full employment, and, ironically, nor have they reduced imports either. Worse still, such policies have led to more external indebtedness, financial and economic dependence on IFI, and continuous sacrifice of national resources. The more recent addiction to foreign direct investment, FDI, has also led for hopes of an FDI-led economic growth. But in reality, growth has continued without any significant impact on employment. In the next section, we will establish the financial feasibility of full employment under an employer of last resort program, thus demonstrating that an employer of last resort-led economic development strategy could achieve the same development goals as ISI, export-led, and FDI-led growth, with the added benefit of full employment, price stability, and financial sovereignty. A significant issue that employer of last resort must tackle is the mismatch of skills between the employer of last resort job openings and the profile of the unemployed. A process of institutional adjustment must take place here as well. Only 0.4% of the employees in public works have post-secondary education. This is primarily due to the very nature of the traditional public works projects being mostly geared towards construction projects that require a modest level of education and skills. The employer of last resort in Tunisia must therefore introduce new kinds of jobs in the public sector that go beyond just basic infrastructure. Footnote 3. We must add that traditional public works projects must also increase in size and should give more attention to sanitation, environmental cleanup, recycling, reforestation, and anti-desertification projects. The potential for job creation in those areas is simply capable of absorbing the entire pool of the hardcore unemployed. End footnote. Such jobs could include public school tutors, public school and/or community musicians, artists, community healthcare consultants, recycling consultants, community historians, community ethnographers, community statisticians, community computer assistants, community web developers and webmasters, and national translation agents. Footnote 4. Websites devoted to informational dissipation, conservation of local, regional history, culture, and traditions. Such projects would involve higher education graduates with degrees, specializations in history, anthropology, sociology, computer science, geology, psychology, ethnography, social work, folklore studies, literature, religious studies, art history, photography, journalism, communications, statistics, music, dance, graphic design, and architecture. End footnote. End footnote 5. Translate major foreign language books, poems, novels, and plays into Arabic language, and translate major Arabic literature to French, English, Italian, Spanish, and German to be published online. End footnote. This new community-based employment dynamic is to be implemented in a decentralized way, but it is to be funded by the national government. 1.5% of GDP spending on ALMP is an extremely low level of spending for a country that has consistently wasted the human capital of at least 15% of its most vibrant working-age population. The same population that the government has spent so much to educate and keep healthy in the last 5 decades. Footnote 6. The consistently high unemployment rate among the young, educated, first-time job seeker is also contributing to the tremendous brain drain from which Tunisia continues to suffer. End footnote. Gradually increasing the budget line for ALMP under an employer of last resort program. Gradually increasing the budget line for ALMP under an employer of last resort program to 3 to 5% of GDP is something that the Tunisian economy can easily handle. See next section.